The city lights outside her window never slept, but inside that high-rise penthouse, silence was louder than any siren on Fifth Avenue. Emma Whitmore used to love the view, the skyline that once felt like promise. Now, it only reminded her of distance. 3 years of marriage to Alexander Cole, one of New York's most admired millionaires, had turned her world into glass beautiful, transparent, and cold. Every night, she waited for his key to turn, for footsteps in the hallway, for a high that rarely came. The dinners were quiet, the smiles practiced. He was there, but not really. Sometimes, Emma caught her reflection in the window and didn't recognize the woman staring back. Her voice, her laughter, her colors all faded into the background of his empire. Yet somewhere beneath that calm, something stirred, a question, a whisper. What if the only way to be seen was to stop disappearing? This isn't just a story about jealousy. It's about what happens when silence meets courage and when a woman decides she deserves to shine again. Because one evening, one black silk dress, and one glance will change everything. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the city still shimmered droplets clinging to glass towers, turning every window into a soft mirror. From the 52nd floor, New York looked endless. Lights flickered like constellations trapped inside buildings. Somewhere below, sirens hummed, a taxi honked, a distant laugh echoed from a rooftop bar. Inside the penthouse, it was quiet, too quiet. Emma Whitmore sat on the edge of the white leather couch, barefoot, a cup of untouched tea cooling beside her. The faint hum of the refrigerator was the only sound that kept her company. She traced the rim of her cup with her fingertip, slow, absent-minded, the way one does when the mind is far away. Around her, everything gleamed: marble counters, silver frames, velvet curtains tall as a church wall. The kind of beauty people dream of, the kind she once thought meant happiness. Now, it just felt like distance dressed in elegance. She glanced at the clock. 9:42 p.m. He was late again. Alexander Cole always had a reason: a meeting that ran long, a flight that couldn't wait, a client dinner that really couldn't be postponed. The man who once drove across the city just to bring her coffee now couldn't spare a phone call. On the counter lay the remains of dinner, 2 plates, one untouched. The pasta had gone cold hours ago. Emma had set the table anyway, out of habit, not hope. She used to wait with music playing softly in the background, candles flickering. Tonight, she hadn't bothered to light them. She stood and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The glass stretched high above her head, reflecting her outline against the glowing skyline. Her reflection looked almost unfamiliar: slender frame and soft loungewear, hair pulled into a loose bun, eyes tired but still carrying a quiet grace. It wasn't the years that had changed her. It was the silence, the kind that doesn't shout, it just settles, slow and heavy, until even breathing feels too loud. Once upon a time, she and Alexander had laughed in this very room, barefoot on marble floors, eating takeout straight from the box, swearing they'd never let work steal their joy. They were unstoppable then. He'd call her his compass, the calm in his chaos. But success had its own hunger. And slowly, piece by piece, she'd watched him disappear behind phone calls, business trips, and headlines that described him as the empire builder. She turned away from the window and looked at the framed photographs on the console, smiling faces frozen in time, their wedding in Central Park, her hand clutching his, a trip to Italy, the sea wind in her hair. She picked up one of the frames and brushed away invisible dust. The glass was cold. When the elevator chimed softly, Emma's body tensed without thinking. She waited: the familiar sound of leather shoes on marble, a door clicking shut, a sigh. "Hey," Alexander said from behind her. His voice was low, polite, distracted, the tone of someone returning to a hotel room, not a home. "Hi," she murmured, still holding the photo frame. He loosened his tie, checking his phone even as he spoke. Did you eat? I waited. A pause. You shouldn't have. He didn't look at her when he said it. He never did anymore. Emma nodded, placed the photo back on the console. Long day. The usual, he muttered. Investors, deadlines, same circus, different clowns. She almost smiled. He used to make that joke and then kiss her forehead. But tonight it sounded empty, like a line he'd repeated too many times. As he walked past her toward the kitchen, she caught a faint trace of his cologne, clean, sharp, familiar. It stirred something in her chest, a memory that hurt more than it healed. He poured himself a drink, scrolled through a few emails, and leaned against the counter. You didn't need to wait up, I know, but she had. Every night, for a moment, neither spoke. The air was thick with words unsaid. Alex, she said softly, do you ever miss how things used to be? He looked up, almost startled by the question. What do you mean? She hesitated. Us. Before everything got so busy. He frowned slightly, as if she'd mentioned something irrelevant. It's just life. Things change. Things change. The simplest phrase, yet it cut deeper than anger. She nodded again, forcing a small smile, then turned back to the window. He didn't notice that her eyes glistened, or maybe he did and chose to look away. He disappeared into his office, the door closing with its soft, magnetic click. Emma exhaled slowly, her chest tightening. In the silence that followed, she walked to the record player. The vinyl crackled as she placed the needle down. A faint melody, slow jazz filled the room, wrapping around her like a fragile memory. She sank into the couch, pulled a blanket over her knees, and stared at the city once more. Down below, a woman laughed bright, carefree, and for some reason, that sound made Emma's throat ache. She remembered who she used to be, the girl who designed homes filled with warmth, not perfection, who believed love was something you built every day, not just a promise you made once. Her phone buzzed. A message from Alexander. Don't wait up. Need to finish some calls. Emma set the phone face down. The screen went dark. The tea beside her had gone cold, but she took a sip anyway. Bitter, still. She swallowed. She looked around the penthouse, spotless, lifeless, and whispered to no one in particular. How can a place this beautiful feel so empty? Outside, the city glowed, alive and unbothered. Somewhere far below, people were laughing, clinking glasses, falling in love, and up here, above it all. Emma sat still, wrapped in silence that didn't even feel like safety anymore. Her eyes drifted toward the sketchbook left open on the table lines of furniture, shapes of rooms, fragments of designs she hadn't finished. Among them, one page stood out. It was a drawing of a woman standing by a window, her outline soft, her face hidden. But light poured all around her. Emma stared at it for a long time. Then, quietly, she picked up a pencil and began to draw again. The lines came slow at first, then steadier her hand, remembering what her heart had almost forgotten: creation, beauty, presence. The soft scratch of graphite filled the air, blending with the music. And for the first time in a long while, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like a pause, the kind that comes right before something begins. Outside, the city blinked, a siren wailed. Inside, Emma drew a single word beneath the sketch: see me. She closed the book gently, a faint smile touching her lips. Somewhere deep inside, she knew, though she couldn't say why, that the night had shifted. Something quiet but certain had begun to change. Morning light filtered through the tall windows, soft and golden, spilling across the marble floors like a quiet reminder that life went on, whether love did or not. Emma sat at the long dining table, her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had already gone lukewarm. The chair across from her was empty again. Alexander had left before sunrise, the way he often did lately, leaving behind the faint scent of his cologne and a note that simply read, "Meeting in Midtown. Don't wait for dinner." She stared at the note for a long time. Not angry, not even sad, just numb. There was a time when his notes were little love letters, small hearts drawn in the margins, promises of late-night desserts and stolen kisses between flights. Now, there were only reminders of absence, words that felt like receipts for another missed moment. She rose, walked to the window, and watched the city awaken below, cabs rushing, horns echoing, people holding hands, coffee steam rising from paper cups. It was all so alive. Yet, up here, in the sky, everything felt paused. She pressed her palm to the glass, feeling the cold bite of the morning. It grounded her somehow. The sharpness of it, proof that she was still here. Her phone buzzed once, a calendar notification, Alexander business dinner, 8:00 p.m. She swiped it away, her throat tightening. Somewhere deep inside, she still wanted to be angry. But the truth was, anger required energy, and she'd spent hers long ago trying to hold on. Later that afternoon, Emma worked in her small home studio, sketching layouts for a client's apartment, letting the rhythm of pencil on paper fill the silence. Her sketches were clean, precise, but she couldn't stop noticing how empty the rooms she designed looked. Maybe that was just her reflection showing through. The door opened quietly behind her. Alexander's voice followed, flat, businesslike. "You're home." She looked up. "I live here." The words slipped out before she could soften them. He paused, adjusting his cufflinks. "I didn't mean it like that." "I know," she said, turning back to her sketch. The sound of pencil against paper was louder than their breathing. He stood in the doorway for a moment, as if he wanted to say something else, but the phone in his hand lit up, and whatever thought he had disappeared behind that screen. "I'll be late tonight," he murmured. Emma nodded, eyes still fixed on her drawing. After he left, the echo of the door closing seemed to linger. She looked down at the sketch she'd been working on, a living room with two chairs facing each other, separated by a wide, empty table. Without thinking, she erased one of the chairs. The remaining one looked lonely, but somehow honest. That night, she ate alone at the table again. The city outside sparkled, a theater of light, but the apartment stayed dim. She tried to read, to listen to music, to distract herself, but every song reminded her of something he used to hum. Every page felt heavy. Around 9, she caught herself scrolling through old photos, the two of them in Paris, his arm around her waist, her laugh frozen mid-air. She touched the screen softly, tracing the shape of her own smile, as if it belonged to someone else. She remembered that day how he'd kissed her nose and said, "Don't move, I want to remember you like this," and maybe that was the problem. He had remembered her like that, a picture, not a person, a beautiful still frame he could keep, not the woman she kept becoming. A siren wailed far below. Emma set the phone down and closed her eyes. The silence pressed against her like water. She wondered if love always ended like this, not in fights, not in betrayal, but in the slow erosion of attention, the kind that steals you grain by grain until one day, you wake up invisible. At midnight. She walked through the apartment, turning off the lights one by one. Her reflection followed her across the glass walls, familiar yet foreign. She paused in the hallway, where the faint glow from Alexander's office door still leaked out. She could hear him talking, his tone crisp, professional. "Yes, I'll review the contract in the morning. No, I don't need rest." She leaned against the wall, eyes closed, listening to the man she used to know, his voice confident, distant, unreachable. There was a time when that same voice whispered dreams into her hair. Now, it only spoke to the world. She turned away and went to bed alone. The sheets were cold on her side. For a long while, Emma couldn't sleep. Her mind kept replaying small fragments, laughter echoing in kitchens, late-night pizza on the floor, the way he used to look at her like she was the reason he worked so hard. She tried to find that look in her memory, but it felt blurred now, like an old photograph that had lost its color. Around 2 a.m., she got up, walked barefoot to the balcony, and stepped into the night air. The city stretched beneath her like a sea of gold and noise. She leaned on the railing, breathing in the cool wind. Somewhere, faintly, she heard music from another building, a jazz tune, distant but warm. She closed her eyes. For a moment, it felt like someone else's life was playing next door, the one she used to have. She whispered, "I miss you," though she wasn't sure if she meant Alexander or herself. The breeze lifted a strand of her hair. The night held its breath. Then, from inside the apartment, she heard the soft ping of a message. She turned, half hoping it was him, but it wasn't. It was a client, confirming an upcoming project. Work, the one thing that still depended on her, noticed her, needed her. She picked up her sketchbook and sat by the balcony door, knees tucked under her chin. The city pulsed quietly beneath her, alive and distant. She began to draw again this time, not an interior, not a room, but a woman standing beneath a single hanging light, alone, but luminous. The lines trembled at first, then steadied, somewhere between the strokes. She realized that silence could be cruel, but it could also be space for something to awaken. When she finished, she wrote a small note beneath the drawing. Love can fade into quiet, but quiet can also become strength. She stared at the words for a long time. They weren't an answer, but they felt true. In the stillness of that early morning, Emma closed her sketchbook, rested her head against the cool glass, and let the hum of the city cradle her back to calm. Outside, the first hint of dawn painted the skyline in pale pink. Inside, she whispered softly, not to be heard, just to remember the sound of her own voice. And though nothing had changed yet, the air felt different, like a room waiting for light. The apartment glowed with a low amber light, the kind that softened edges, turned shadows gold, and made silence almost tender. Outside, the city pulsed car horns, laughter, a saxophone spilling from a bar across the avenue. Inside, Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by sheets of tracing paper, pencils, color swatches, and a half-finished design were scattered like fragments of her own thoughts. It was close to midnight. Alexander's office door was closed again, his voice faint behind it, words she couldn't make out, numbers, decisions, a life lived in another language. Emma drew another line on the page, but her hand stopped halfway. She stared at the faint gray mark, at how it faded before reaching the edge, like so many things lately unfinished. She set the pencil down and leaned back against the couch, breathing slowly. The lamp beside her flickered once, then steadied, in that small pool of golden light. She caught her reflection in the glass door that led to the balcony. The same woman, same quiet, same tired grace. But there was something new tonight, an ache sharper than sadness, a spark of defiance. She rose, barefoot, and walked toward the window. The skyline stretched wide before her, jeweled and endless. New York, alive, indifferent, magnificent. She pressed her forehead lightly to the cool glass, whispering to herself, "If he can't see me anymore, then I'll make the whole city see." The words came out low, trembling, but real. For a moment, she stood still, surprised by her own voice. She hadn't sounded that certain in years. Behind her, Alexander's voice carried through the half-open office door. "No, we'll close the deal Monday. Yes, I'll fly to Miami myself." He laughed that charming, practiced laugh she once loved, but it felt foreign now, hollow against the golden quiet of the room. Emma turned away. Her bare feet made no sound on the marble, but her heartbeat filled the silence. She went to her closet, not looking for anything in particular, just something that reminded her of color, of skin, of being alive. Her fingers brushed past tailored dresses and muted silk, all chosen for his world, not hers. Beige, navy, ivory, safe, invisible. Then, hidden near the back, she found a small box with the scent of old perfume. Inside lay a black silk dress, folded neatly, soft as memory. She had worn it once, years ago, on a trip to Malibu. The night they danced barefoot on the beach, the night he couldn't stop staring at her. She lifted it out slowly, the fabric whispering against her hands. For the first time in so long. She smiled just a little. The city lights blinked through the glass as she held the dress against her, turning it in the light. It was shorter than anything she'd worn in years, daring in a quiet way, the kind of dress that asked to be noticed. And in that instant, Emma realized it wasn't about vanity. It was about presence, about reclaiming the parts of herself she'd tucked away to fit inside someone else's rhythm. She walked to the mirror, holding the dress against her body. The reflection was almost shocking. A hint of the woman she used to be looked back bold, laughing, full of pulse and promise. Her chest tightened, not from pain this time, but from something that felt dangerously like hope. In the distance, Alexander's office door opened. His voice approached, quieter now. Did you see my—" He stopped when he saw her. Emma turned slightly, the dress still in her hands. Their eyes met in the golden light. He blinked, as if unsure what he was seeing. "You're still up. Couldn't sleep." He hesitated. "You found that old dress." She nodded, waiting for the familiar comment. Too much skin, too little reason, but it didn't come. He only stared, a faint crease between his brows. Then his phone buzzed. The spell broke. "Work," he muttered, already looking away. "Good night." She watched him disappear down the hall again, his voice fading into another call. Emma exhaled, the air leaving her chest in one long, steady sigh. She placed the dress over the arm of the couch and sat beside it. Her hands traced the fabric absently. That moment, his glance, her quiet could have hurt. It usually would have. But tonight, it didn't. Tonight. The silence felt different. It didn't swallow her. It challenged her. She looked around the room, seeing it anew, the art on the walls, chosen by a decorator, not her, the spotless counters, the untouched wine glasses, a life curated to impress, not to feel. And in that golden stillness, she whispered to herself, "I don't want to be decoration." The city outside seemed to pulse in agreement, its lights shimmering like applause. She rose again, folded the dress carefully, and laid it across the chair near her vanity. Tomorrow, she told herself. Tomorrow, she'd wear it, not for him, not for anyone, for herself, for the version of her who still believed in joy. The clock on the wall ticked past one as, She turned off the lamp, letting the darkness settle. Only the soft glow from the city filtered in, tracing her outline as she walked toward the window once more. New York sparkled fierce, alive, unapologetic. Emma smiled faintly. Maybe that's what she'd been missing, that audacity to exist brightly, even when no one's watching. She pressed her hand to the glass again, the same way she had so many nights before. But this time, it wasn't longing she felt. It was a quiet promise, a beginning. And though Alexander's voice still murmured from another room, somewhere deep inside, she no longer felt small beneath it, because something had shifted, something unstoppable. The golden light flickered once more, then went out, and in the dark, Emma's eyes stayed open wide, awake, alive. The night of the gala arrived wrapped in the kind of winter chill that made the city shimmer. Snow hadn't fallen yet, but the air carried that faint promise, sharp, silver, expectant. From the penthouse window, the skyline glittered like jewelry scattered across black velvet. Emma stood before her mirror, her vanity lights soft and golden, her reflection distant. She had spent the afternoon preparing for this evening, Alexander's company's annual gala at the plaza. It was one of those nights where appearances mattered, where every handshake could shift the future of a deal. She knew the script by heart: smile, stand by his side, say little, and sparkle just enough to be photographed. On the bed lay two dresses. One was the safe choice, a long champagne-colored gown, elegant, flawless, and utterly forgettable. The kind of dress Alexander once described as perfectly appropriate. The other was the black silk one she had found days earlier, folded away like a secret. Emma reached for the champagne gown first. The fabric was smooth, expensive, heavy in her hands. She slipped it on, zipped the back, and stepped toward the mirror. The woman who looked back at her was every inch the millionaire's wife, poised, refined, untouched, and yet the eyes staring back were empty. She tilted her head slightly, studying herself as though she were a stranger. The pearls around her neck caught the light, but her face had no spark, no warmth, just polite composure. A quiet whisper escaped her lips. "Is this what I've become?" The clock ticked, the city murmured below. Somewhere in the apartment. Alexander's phone buzzed again. Emma exhaled, long and steady, then reached for the zipper at her back. The sound of it lowering filled the silence like a decision being made. She let the champagne gown fall to the floor, a soft sigh of silk. For a moment, she stood there in nothing but her slip, the golden light painting her shoulders. Then she opened the box where the black dress waited. The silk felt cool against her fingertips like a memory waking up. She slipped it on, smoothing the fabric over her hips. It fit her like breath. Light. Dangerous. Alive. When she lifted her gaze again, the mirror didn't show a stranger. It showed the woman she used to be. The one who laughed with her whole body, who danced barefoot on hotel balconies, who believed she could build a world out of love. She smiled not out of vanity, but recognition. Behind her, Alexander's reflection appeared in the mirror, caught mid-step. He froze. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. His expression was unreadable, caught between surprise and disbelief. "You're wearing that." His tone wasn't cruel, just cautious. Emma turned slightly, her earrings catching the light. "Why not? It's different." She met his gaze through the mirror. "That's the point." He looked at her a moment longer, then said quietly, "We need to leave in 20 minutes. He turned, adjusting his cufflinks as he walked away. The door closed softly behind him. Emma stared at her reflection once more. Her pulse was steady now. For the first time in years, she felt her own presence fill the room, not as decoration, but as a heartbeat. Later, in the car, the city slid by in waves of light and sound. Alexander sat beside her, scrolling through his phone, answering texts. The reflection of his screen flickered across his face, but he didn't look up. Emma turned her eyes to the window, people walking, laughing, holding hands in coats and scarves. For the first time, she envied strangers. The plaza rose before them in gold and marble, chandeliers glowing behind its tall windows. Cameras flashed as limousines arrived, spilling out the city's elite. Alexander stepped out first, offering her his hand. She took it not out of need, but grace. Inside, the ballroom was a cascade of light. Strings of crystal chandeliers swayed gently above tables draped in white. Waiters floated through with champagne trays. The hum of conversation filled every corner. As they entered, heads turned, Emma felt it, the shift, the glances, the sudden hush. The black silk caught the light in all the right places. It wasn't loud, it was alive. "Mrs. Cole, you look stunning tonight," someone murmured as they passed. Another man, a business associate she barely knew, smiled with polite admiration. Alexander's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly. Emma caught the flicker, that tiny flash of something in his eyes. Possessive, confused, almost jealous. But she said nothing. They moved through the crowd, exchanging smiles and handshakes. Emma did what she always did, stood beside him, smiled when appropriate, listened. But tonight, she wasn't just listening. She was watching the way he charmed the room, the way people leaned into his voice, the way she'd once done. And for the first time, she wondered how much of that charm had ever been hers to keep. Halfway through the evening, Alexander excused himself to speak with an investor. Emma stood alone for a while, sipping her drink, letting the music wash over her. The jazz band began a slow, lilting tune, rich and aching. She closed her eyes for a second, just breathing, feeling the rhythm move through her like a heartbeat she'd forgotten. Beautiful night. Isn't it? A voice said beside her. She opened her eyes to see a man younger, perhaps early 30s, with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Yes, she replied softly. I don't think we've met. I'm Daniel. I work with one of your husband's partners. She nodded, polite. Emma? He tilted his head slightly, studying her. You don't seem like someone who enjoys these things. Emma smiled faintly. Is it that obvious? He laughed quietly. You look like you'd rather be anywhere else. Maybe, she said, her tone warm but distant. Still. She couldn't help but notice he looked at her. Really looked, not past her, not through her. It was such a simple thing, and yet it felt rare. Across the room, Alexander had turned. His gaze found her, standing beneath the chandelier, the black silk gleaming against her skin. His smile faltered as he saw her laugh softly at something Daniel said. And in that moment, that small, quiet moment, something shifted inside him. The man who'd forgotten how to notice suddenly couldn't look away. Emma, unaware, lifted her glass slightly, her eyes catching the light. She didn't see his expression harden, the tension in his jaw. She didn't hear the low voice beside him saying, Your wife looks radiant tonight. Alexander's response was quiet, clipped. Yes, she does. The music swelled, laughter echoed, and somewhere between the clink of glasses and the murmur of the crowd, the air between them began to change fragile, electric, alive. Emma felt it without knowing why. A tremor, faint but certain, like the city before a storm. She placed her glass down slowly, her eyes finding his across the room. Neither of them smiled, but the silence that stretched between them said more than words ever could. The city hadn't yet slept when Emma woke. A faint glow from the streetlights painted soft streaks across the bedroom walls, turning the air gold and silver. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clasped loosely in her lap. Alexander's side was empty, the sheets cold. Somewhere. She could still hear his voice from the night before, polite, distant, talking business, while her heart quietly unraveled under the weight of that long, glittering evening at the plaza. She had seen the way his eyes followed her, the flicker of jealousy he'd tried to hide behind a composed smile. It wasn't anger that lingered in her now. It was clarity. For the first time in years, she didn't crave his attention. She wanted her own. She rose and walked barefoot across the room, the marble floor cool under her skin. Outside, dawn began to blush behind the skyline, soft and slow. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the city below, a sound that had become her constant companion. In front of the mirror, she caught her reflection again. Her hair still fell in loose waves from the night before, her lipstick faint but present, like an echo of something beautiful that refused to fade. She studied herself, not with vanity, but with curiosity. The woman staring back seemed familiar, yet new. Emma turned toward the closet, her fingers brushing past gowns and coats until they found the one thing that still carried warmth, the black silk dress. The same one that had changed everything the night before, not because of how it looked, but because of what it reminded her of. Freedom, youth, herself. She slipped it from the hanger and held it up against the morning light. The silk caught the glow like liquid shadow, smooth and unafraid. She remembered Malibu the first trip after their wedding, when everything still felt wild and unscripted. They'd danced barefoot in the sand that night. He'd told her she looked like starlight in human form, and she had believed him. Her throat tightened with the memory. That version of her, open, playful, radiant, had gone quiet somewhere along the way. But she wasn't gone. She was still here, waiting behind layers of silence. Emma laid the dress gently on the bed and sat beside it, running her hand over the fabric. It's time, she whispered. The words felt like a promise. She stood and began to get ready. Not for him, not for any party, but for herself. She turned on soft music, an old jazz record she loved, the kind that filled the room without demanding anything. The notes wrapped around her like the ocean breeze she remembered from Malibu. She washed her face, brushed her hair until it shimmered, then reached for the red lipstick she hadn't worn in years. The first touch of color felt like courage, a small act of rebellion, soft and quiet, but powerful. When she slipped into the dress, it molded to her like a memory returning home. She looked in the mirror again. The woman there wasn't flawless. Her eyes carried sleeplessness. Her smile was uncertain, but she was alive. And that was enough. She laughed, a real, low laugh that startled her. It had been so long since she'd heard her own laughter fill the air. It sounded strange and beautiful, like a room reopening after being closed for too long. She added earrings, small gold hoops, and let her hair fall free. For years she'd worn it tied back, neat and proper, the way Alexander preferred. Now it tumbled over her shoulders, wild, soft, unconcerned. When she was done, she turned off the lights, leaving only the glow from the window. The black dress shimmered faintly in the dimness, alive under the pulse of the city beyond. Alexander's footsteps sounded faintly from the hallway. He must have come home late, or maybe he hadn't left at all. She heard him pause by the door, then the quiet click as it opened. He stopped. Emma didn't turn right away. She stood by the window, one hand resting on the glass. The city reflected in her eyes. Alexander's voice came low, uncertain. "You're up early." She turned then. Slow. Calm. Couldn't sleep. He took her in the black dress, the red lips, the quiet confidence. "You're dressed for something." "Maybe I am," she said softly. He hesitated. "You look different." Emma smiled faintly. "Maybe I finally remembered who I am." The silence between them stretched not cold this time, but heavy with realization. He stepped closer, as if drawn by something beyond logic. "Where are you going?" She shrugged gently. "Nowhere special. Just out." He studied her for a long moment, then said, almost reluctantly, "You don't need to go anywhere. You already have everything here." Her eyes met his steady, kind, unflinching. "Everything you think I need." It wasn't said with anger, just truth. He had no reply. Emma reached for her clutch and walked past him toward the door. Her perfume lingered jasmine and something warm, like memory. Before she stepped out, she looked back once. "Don't wait up." And then she was gone. The elevator doors closed with a soft chime. Alexander stood alone in the quiet apartment, the sound of her footsteps fading into the hum of the city. For the first time, he felt what she had been feeling all along, absence not as peace, but as loss. Outside, the streets were waking. Emma walked with no destination, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. People brushed past her, strangers, busy, alive. The cold air touched her skin, and it didn't feel harsh. It felt real. She crossed Fifth Avenue just as the first snow began to fall, flakes catching in her hair. She tilted her face upward, eyes closing, letting them melt on her lashes. The city buzzed around her, but she felt still centered. For years, she had existed in someone else's orbit. Now, for the first time, she was her own gravity. Her phone buzzed in her purse. She didn't look. She just kept walking. The black silk swaying against her legs. Red lipstick bright against the pale morning. Each step felt lighter. Each breath felt her own. And as the city stretched open before her, endless, indifferent, beautiful, she smiled quietly to herself. The black dress wasn't just fabric. It was freedom. It was a beginning disguised as elegance. And though she didn't know where she was going yet, she knew this much: she would never again live small enough to disappear. The wind rose, carrying the sound of distant music from somewhere downtown. Emma turned toward it, her hair catching the light, her lips curved in a knowing, gentle smile. The city, at last, was looking back. When the elevator doors slid open that evening, Alexander stepped into a silence unlike any he'd known before. The apartment was dimly lit, washed in the soft amber glow of the city lights beyond the glass walls. His tie was loose, his phone still in his hand, the rhythm of the day's noise echoing faintly in his mind, meetings, calls, deals. But as he walked down the hallway, something shifted. The air felt different, still, but alive. He could hear faint jazz music playing somewhere inside a melody, slow and warm, threading through the quiet like a pulse. He followed it, and then he saw her. Emma was standing by the window, the skyline stretching out behind her like a sea of light. Her hair, loose and dark, caught the shimmer of the city. The black silk dress clung to her like a whisper, simple, elegant, alive. Her back was straight, her posture calm. There was nothing ostentatious about her, yet the room seemed to bend toward her, as if drawn by gravity. For a long moment, Alexander forgot to breathe. He had seen her every day for 3 years across breakfast tables, in the passenger seat of cars, at events where she smiled on cue, yet somehow, he realized he hadn't truly looked at her in all that time. Not like this, not as a person, not as Emma. Emma. His voice came out lower than he intended, hesitant, almost unfamiliar to his own ears. She turned her head slightly, just enough for him to see her profile in the half-light. The red of her lips caught him first, soft, deliberate, confident. "You're home early," she said, her tone calm, neither surprised nor cold. He took a step closer, then another. He stopped, searching for words that didn't sound foolish. Beautiful obvious. Change too small. "Finally," he said, almost under his breath. "You look incredible." She smiled gently, but it wasn't the shy smile he remembered. It was one of quiet acknowledgement, a woman aware of her own presence. "Thank you." Her voice was steady, almost melodic. It carried no expectation, no hunger for approval, just truth. He realized then how rare that sound had become, between them words that didn't belong to pretense or routine. For a few seconds, the world outside faded. The only sound was the faint brush of her dress as she moved, and the hum of the city beneath them. Alexander felt something unfamiliar stir in him, something dangerously close to longing. He wanted to say her name again, to bridge the space between them, but he didn't. Instead, he stood there, still, watching the way the light touched her skin, how her eyes carried both warmth and distance. It unsettled him. He had built entire empires, bent people and markets to his will, yet at that moment, he couldn't command the attention of the one person who mattered most. "Where are you going?" he asked finally, because he couldn't think of anything else to say. Emma turned back to the window. "Out," she said simply. "With who?" She let out a soft breath, almost a laugh. "With myself?" He blinked, caught off guard. "You don't have to." She faced him then, her eyes meeting his fully. "I know." The way she said it, not sharp, not defensive, stopped him cold. He wanted to respond, to reach for her, but something in her gaze made him hesitate. It wasn't rejection, it was self-possession. And for a man like Alexander Cole, who was used to being the center of every room, that look calm, sure, unbothered was more disarming than any argument could be. He found himself remembering Malibu, the night she wore that very dress, the sound of her laughter mixing with the waves, the way her hair had smelled of salt and sun. He remembered thinking then that she was too good for the world he lived in, and somewhere along the way, he'd made her smaller to fit inside it. Now, looking at her, he saw the woman she had been and the woman she had become in spite of him. "You're different," he said finally. Emma tilted her head. "No, just awake." Her words hung in the air like a note that refused to fade. He took another step toward her. "Emma, I didn't mean for things to, Alexander." She said his name softly, almost kindly. "You don't have to explain tonight. Some things don't need words." That stopped him again. She turned away, picked up her clutch from the table, and slid on a pair of heels black, simple, like the dress. Her movements were graceful, deliberate. When she reached for her coat, Alexander found his voice again. "Wait." She paused at the door but didn't turn. "I'll come with you," he said. Emma looked back over her shoulder, her eyes steady. "No, you'll come when you're ready to see me for more than how I look tonight." Then she smiled faint, knowing, unhurried, and stepped into the hallway. The elevator chimed, soft and distant. Alexander stood in the silence that followed, his chest tight, his throat dry. He walked to the window where she'd stood moments ago. Her reflection still lingered faintly in the glass, ghost-like, luminous. Outside, the city moved on, glittering and loud, but for him, everything felt still. He leaned a hand against the window pane, exhaling slowly. Somewhere deep in his chest, something shifted an ache, an awareness, a question he didn't yet know how to answer. When had she become a mystery again? And why did he suddenly want, more than anything, to solve it? The record player still hummed softly in the background, the same jazz melody looping. Alexander closed his eyes for a moment and let it play. The notes felt heavier now, like memory, like loss, like the first edge of regret. He turned his gaze toward the door. The faintest trace of her perfume still lingered in the air. Jasmine, with a hint of something wild. And in that scent, in that quiet, he realized for the first time in years, he had truly seen her. Not the polished wife in the photographs, not the name on the invitations, but the woman alive, unafraid, untouchable. He didn't move for a long time, just stood there, the city burning below him, the echo of her footsteps still alive in his mind. Then, softly, he whispered to the empty room. "Emma," no answer, only the hum of the city indifferent, vast, and a man finally learning what it meant to miss someone who had never really left. The chandeliers at the plaza shimmered like captured constellations, each crystal catching the light and scattering it across the ballroom. The room was a symphony of silk, perfume, and soft laughter, a carefully choreographed world of power and polish. And yet, in that glittering crowd, one figure seemed to draw every glance, every whisper, every turn of a curious head. Emma Cole. She stood near the grand staircase, the black silk of her dress flowing like liquid shadow against the pale marble floor. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, catching the glow from the chandeliers above. She wasn't trying to command attention. She simply existed calmly, fully, radiantly, and the room responded. Alexander saw it the moment they stepped in. Heads turned. A photographer's flash lit the edge of her profile. Conversations paused mid-sentence as eyes followed her. And something inside him, something long dormant, stirred awake. Jealousy. It arrived quietly. Not as rage, but as an ache. A tightening in his chest that made it suddenly hard to breathe. For years, Alexander Cole had lived untouched by such feelings. He'd been envied, respected, even feared in his world of deals and decisions. But envy directed toward him, toward the woman at his side. It had been a long time since he'd felt that. Emma felt it too. The eyes, the whispers, but she didn't shrink from them. She smiled when people greeted her, answered politely, but her gaze kept drifting beyond the surface of conversation. She wasn't there to prove anything. She was there to live in her own skin again. And somehow, that quiet confidence burned brighter than any diamond in the room. A man approached Daniel, the young partner she'd met once before. He carried the same ease as that night, his expression open, his tone warm. "Mrs. Cole," he said, offering his hand. "It's good to see you again." Emma took his hand, her smile gentle. "Daniel. You remember names well? Some are worth remembering." Their laughter mingled softly with the music. Across the room, Alexander felt his pulse quicken. He watched Daniel lean in, watched his wife's eyes soften with genuine amusement. It wasn't flirtation, not really, but it was connection, and he hadn't been the one to spark it. He turned away, trying to distract himself with conversation, investors, numbers, safe topics. But his mind refused to cooperate. His ears caught fragments her voice, light and melodic, carrying through the hum of the crowd. He realized, with a sinking sense of shame, that he hadn't heard her laugh like that in years. A waiter passed by with champagne, and Alexander took a glass, his fingers tightening around the stem. From where he stood, he could see her reflection in the ballroom's grand mirror. The black dress shimmered as she moved. Her hand brushed a strand of hair from her cheek, an unconscious gesture, and it struck him with the force of memory, the same movement she used to make on the beach in Malibu, when her hair kept tangling in the wind. He had loved her then, completely, foolishly, without calculation. What had happened to that version of them? The jazz band began a new number, slow, intoxicating, full of longing. The crowd shifted toward the dance floor. Daniel turned to Emma and offered his hand. "May I?" She hesitated, glancing instinctively toward Alexander. He was watching, his face unreadable. Then, for the first time that evening, she looked away. "Yes," she said softly, placing her hand in Daniel's. The music wrapped around them as they moved into the crowd. It wasn't an intimate dance, just a rhythm shared, graceful, distant, but alive. Emma followed the steps easily, her body remembering what it was like to move freely. She laughed once, a sound that made a few heads turn again. Alexander's jaw tightened. The champagne in his hand tasted bitter now. He set the glass down too quickly, the crystal clinking against the marble tray. He tried to tell himself it was nothing, that she was simply being polite, that this was a party like any other, but the truth clawed at him. He wasn't angry at her. He was angry at himself, because he had been blind long enough for another man to see her first. The song ended slowly, the final note hanging in the air like a sigh. Daniel bowed slightly, his hand still resting at the small of her back. Emma smiled in thanks, but before she could step away, another voice cut in, deep, low, steady. "Excuse me," Alexander said, his hand extended toward her. "May I, for a moment?" Daniel froze, reading the air. Then he smiled politely and nodded. "Of course." Emma turned toward Alexander. Her heartbeat faltered, surprised. She hadn't danced with him in years. He took her hand, the contact sending a pulse through him, something both familiar and strange. She hesitated, just long enough for him to notice, then allowed him to draw her closer. The music swelled again, another slow, aching melody. Alexander's palm rested lightly against her waist. He could feel the warmth of her skin beneath the silk, the soft rise and fall of her breath. For a few seconds, neither spoke. The noise of the crowd faded. It was just them, the rhythm, and the small, impossible distance that years of silence had built between them. "You still remember how to lead," she murmured, her tone half teasing, half wistful. He looked down at her, his voice low. "I remember everything." Her eyes met his calm, searching, a little sad. He wanted to say more, to apologize, to explain, to pull her closer until the room disappeared. But he couldn't find the words. Instead, he simply held her, the way a man holds something he's terrified to lose again. The song ended. Applause rippled through the room. Emma stepped back gently, her fingers slipping from his. "Thank you," she said. Alexander nodded, but the look in his eyes said more than any thank you could. He wasn't ready to let go. As she walked away, her perfume lingered jasmine and light. He stood there for a moment, watching her disappear into the sea of faces, feeling the echo of her touch still on his skin. And for the first time in years, Alexander Cole, the man who built towers, who negotiated empires, realized how fragile power truly was. Because no empire, no title, no fortune could compare to what he had just almost remembered and almost lost again. He exhaled, long and slow, his eyes still following her across the ballroom. Jealousy had awoken, but beneath it, something deeper had stirred, something far more dangerous. Love, rediscovered too late, and yet, not entirely gone. The band began a new song, slow, aching, almost fragile, the kind of melody that seemed to float through the room and settle inside your chest before you even realized it. Conversations softened, laughter dimmed, and couples drifted toward the dance floor, drawn by the gentle pull of the music. Emma stood near the edge of the crowd, a champagne glass in her hand, her reflection shimmering faintly in the tall mirrors of the plaza's ballroom. The lights were warm, golden, almost dreamlike, around her. Everything gleamed polished marble, polished manners, yet she felt suspended, watching her own life from a small distance. Mrs. Cole, a voice said beside her, breaking through the music. She turned. It was Daniel again, the young partner with kind eyes and a confidence that didn't try too hard. He smiled. It would be a shame not to dance tonight. For a brief moment, Emma hesitated. Dancing had always been something private for her, something she'd once shared with Alexander, back when laughter and love came easily. But that was long ago. She felt the weight of years between then and now, heavy as silence. Still, something in Daniel's tone, gentle, respectful, unassuming, made her nod. "All right," she said softly. He offered his hand. She placed hers in his. His touch was polite, steady, almost formal. Together. They stepped onto the dance floor, where the world blurred into candlelight and music. As they moved, Emma let herself breathe. Daniel led carefully, giving her space, never pulling too close. She hadn't realized until that moment how long it had been since she'd been looked at with kindness. Not admiration, not obligation, just simple, human warmth. And then, across the room, Alexander saw them. He had been talking to a client, half listening, half searching for her in the crowd, until suddenly, he didn't have to search. She was there, in the center of the room, the black silk of her dress catching the light as she turned. Her hand rested lightly on Daniel's shoulder, her face calm, almost serene. Alexander's throat tightened. The sound around him faded, the laughter, the glasses clinking, the deals being made, all replaced by the low hum of jealousy, sharp and unfamiliar. He couldn't look away. For years. Emma had been by his side, invisible in plain sight, and now, when the world finally saw her, he realized too late that he'd been blind. His chest ached with something he couldn't name. Not anger, not quite regret. It was closer to grief, the kind that comes when you realize you've lost something precious long before you noticed it was gone. He took a step forward, but stopped. What right did he have to interrupt, to claim she wasn't his shadow anymore? And yet, when Daniel's hand slipped just slightly to the curve of her waist, instinct overpowered thought. Alexander crossed the room before he knew he was moving. His voice cut through the music, low, controlled, but heavy with something unspoken. "Excuse me," he said, his gaze fixed on Daniel. "But my wife already has a dance partner." The words hung there, startling in their calmness. Daniel looked between them, reading the moment, then smiled politely. "Of course." He stepped back, bowing his head slightly toward Emma. "Thank you for the dance, Mrs. Cole." Emma turned, meeting Alexander's eyes. For a heartbeat, they just stared at each other, the air thick, the room holding its breath. Then, without a word, he extended his hand. "May I?" She hesitated, not because she didn't want to, but because she didn't trust what it might awaken. But the music was still playing, and something in his gaze, a mix of apology and longing, made her nod. She placed her hand in his. His fingers closed gently around hers, familiar and new all at once. He drew her close, one arm around her waist, the other holding her hand just above his heart. And then they began to move. It wasn't perfect. They were out of sync at first. Years of silence had their own rhythm, but soon their steps fell into place, slow and sure, as if some old memory had been waiting patiently to be remembered. Emma felt his heartbeat under her palm, steady but quick. His breath brushed her hair when he spoke. "You look—" He stopped himself, shaking his head softly. I don't have a word for it. She smiled faintly. That's all right. You never needed words. He glanced down at her, a hint of sadness in his eyes. Maybe that was the problem. They moved in silence again. Closer now, the distance between them collapsing into something both familiar and fragile. For the first time in years, Alexander wasn't thinking about anything, not business, not appearances, not control, just her, the way her head fit against his shoulder, the way her perfumed jasmine, faint and warm, lingered in the air between them. Emma felt it too, that strange, weightless ache that comes when something broken begins to stir again. But she didn't close her eyes this time. She wanted to see him, to know if this moment was real. The band slowed, the music thinned to its final notes. Around them, applause rose softly, but they didn't stop. They stayed still, his hand still resting at her waist, her fingers still curled against his chest. It was as if the world had narrowed to that single point, breath against breath, heartbeat against heartbeat, a fragile truce between two people who had almost forgotten how to be seen by each other. Finally, Emma stepped back. The warmth lingered, but she broke the silence first. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. I know, Alexander replied. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed him. I wanted to. Her gaze softened, but she didn't answer. There was too much history for simple words to fix. She turned slightly, glancing toward the windows. Snow had begun to fall outside, slow, deliberate flakes drifting past the glass. Do you remember Malibu? He asked suddenly. She looked back at him, surprised. Of course. You wore that same dress, he said, almost to himself. And I couldn't take my eyes off you then, either. The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. She opened her mouth, but nothing came. The orchestra began another song, brighter this time, lively, and the spell broke. Emma smiled softly, the kind of smile that hid as much as it revealed. I think I'll get some air. He nodded, watching her walk away through the crowd, black silk swaying, hair loose, unbothered by the eyes that still followed her. Alexander stayed where he was, his hand still hovering in midair where hers had been. The scent of jasmine lingered faintly, the echo of music threading through the noise. And for a moment, he understood jealousy wasn't just about losing someone to another. It was about realizing how easily you could lose them to themselves. He looked toward the doors where she'd disappeared and whispered, almost in wonder, "She's not the same." No one heard him, but deep inside, he knew neither was he. The car ride home was quiet, the kind of quiet that hums beneath the skin, not peaceful, but charged. Outside, Manhattan's nightlights blurred through the rain-streaked windows, gold and gray and endless. Inside, the only sound was the soft hum of the tires and the faint rhythm of Emma's breathing beside him. She sat turned toward the window, her hand resting lightly in her lap, the black silk of her dress catching traces of passing light. Alexander gripped the steering wheel tighter than he needed to, every muscle in his jaw drawn taut. He wanted to say something, anything, but every word that came to mind sounded too small, too late. The silence between them felt like a wall built one forgotten conversation at a time. When they reached the penthouse, Emma stepped out first. She didn't wait for him to open her door, didn't pause for him to follow. The click of her heels echoed down the marble hallway, steady and deliberate. Alexander followed a few steps behind, his heart hammering against the weight of things unsaid. The elevator doors closed behind them. The sound of the city faded away. Only the hum of the lift remained, that soft, confined sound that made every silence louder. Emma stood facing forward, her reflection in the mirrored walls pale and distant. Alexander's eyes flickered toward her, once, then away. When the elevator opened, she walked out before him, straight to the living room. The city glittered beyond the tall windows, reflected faintly in the polished glass of the coffee table. She set down her clutch, turned off the faint music still playing from the night before, and finally exhaled. Alexander lingered in the doorway, his voice low, uncertain. Emma? She didn't turn. Don't. Her tone wasn't angry. It was calm, too calm, that kind of calm that comes after years of noise. He took a step closer. I'm tired. Alexander. She faced him now, her expression unreadable, tired of pretending that silence is enough. He opened his mouth, but she raised a hand, stopping him. You don't get to interrupt this time. The quiet between them stretched. Then, slowly, she began to speak, her voice low, steady, and heartbreakingly clear. For years, I've tried to tell myself it was fine, that maybe love just changes shape, that maybe we were too busy building something to notice what we were losing. But tonight she paused, her breath trembling just slightly. Tonight I realized I'm not invisible. I've just been erased in slow motion. Alexander's throat tightened. That's not fair. She gave a soft, bitter laugh. Fair. You built a life that had no space for me, and then called it success. You gave me a home in the sky, but no place to stand beside you. I became part of the furniture, polished, quiet, always in the right place. Her words were gentle, but they hit like stones. He took another step forward. I didn't mean for that to happen. I thought I was working for us. She finished for him. I know. I told myself that too. But somewhere along the way, us stopped existing. There was just you and the empire you built and me, standing in the reflection, waiting to matter again. He looked down, his hands curling at his sides. You do matter. Emma. Then why did you stop seeing me? Her voice cracked then, the first fracture in her composure. Do you know what it feels like to sit across from someone you love and realize they'd rather be anywhere else? To talk and see their eyes drift past you, like you're background noise. Alexander said nothing, because he did know. He just hadn't been brave enough to admit it. Emma took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. I stopped speaking because it didn't change anything. I thought silence would keep the peace. But silence doesn't heal. Alexander, it just buries things alive. The words hung there heavy, final. He walked toward her then, slow, deliberate. You're right, he said quietly. I did stop seeing you. I don't know when it happened, but I built a world where I thought control was the same as care, and I lost you inside it. His voice faltered. But tonight, when I saw you and every person in that room turned to look, I realized something I should have known long ago. He looked up, meeting her eyes. You were never meant to live in my shadow. You were meant to light the room. Emma's eyes shimmered, but she didn't speak. She stood perfectly still, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. He stepped closer, but stopped just short of reaching for her. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just need you to know I see you now. Really see you. Her breath caught. For a moment, neither moved. The city lights reflected across their faces, flickering gold, fading silver as if the skyline itself was listening. Emma looked away first. It took you too long, she whispered. I know. Silence again. But it wasn't the old silence, cold and distant. This one felt raw, alive, full of weight and air. She walked to the window, her arms wrapping around herself. I don't know what happens next, she said quietly. I just know I can't go back to who I was. He turned to face her, his voice soft. Maybe you don't have to. She turned, surprised. He took a slow breath. Maybe we start over. Not from what we were, but from who we are now. Her eyes searched his, looking for sincerity, for something real beneath the regret. You think it's that simple? No, he said, but maybe it's worth trying. For a long moment, neither spoke. The city outside blinked in and out of focus through the glass. Snow beginning to fall again, small, quiet flakes drifting past the skyline. Emma's voice broke the silence, soft as breath. You really hurt me. Alexander? He nodded. I know. I don't know if I can love you the same way again. Then love me differently, he whispered. Or not at all. Just don't disappear. Her eyes filled then, not with sadness, but something gentler. She turned back toward the window, her reflection overlapping his in the glass, two outlines blurred by light. Neither moved. Outside, the snow thickened, soft and soundless, and somewhere between confession and forgiveness, between all the things said and unsaid, something fragile shifted. Not quite reconciliation, not yet, but the first breath of it. Emma closed her eyes, her voice barely audible. "It's strange," she said. "For the first time in years, it finally feels like we're talking." Alexander exhaled, a sound that was half sigh, half relief. "Then maybe we're finally beginning." The snow kept falling, the city kept glowing, and in the quiet warmth of their penthouse, two people stood beneath the soft hum of a world still turning, not fixed, not finished, but no longer broken beyond repair. The rain came suddenly, the kind that falls without warning, heavy and relentless, turning the city into a blur of silver and glass. From the window, New York looked softer under the storm, as if even its restless heartbeat had slowed. The penthouse lights were dim, the kind of dim that carries its own warmth, and Emma stood by the glass, watching the rain streak down in trembling lines. She could hear Alexander behind her, quiet, unmoving. The air between them felt fragile, charged, like something about to break. Neither had spoken for a while. Their earlier conversation still hung in the air raw, unfinished, alive. Words had been said, and for once, they hadn't vanished into the usual silence. They'd left marks instead, the kind that sting, but also heal. Emma's fingers brushed the glass absently, tracing the trail of a raindrop. Her voice, when it came, was soft. "It's strange," she said, "how the city never sleeps, but somehow we forgot how to stay awake." Alexander looked up from where he sat, his elbows on his knees, his tie loose, his shirt collar open. He studied her, the shape of her shoulders, the reflection of the stormlight flickering across her hair. He wanted to say something, to reach for her, but the right words were like smoke. They disappeared when he tried to grasp them. "You're right," he said finally, his voice rough. "We were so busy pretending to have everything. We didn't notice what we'd already lost." Emma turned to face him. Her eyes, those soft, steady eyes, were filled with something deeper than sadness. It wasn't anger anymore. It was truth. "Do you even know what you lost, Alexander?" He met her gaze. "Yes," he said simply. "You." The honesty in his tone caught her off guard. It wasn't grand or desperate, just real. And somehow, that made it heavier. She crossed her arms, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not that easy." "I know," he said, "but I'm not asking for easy. I'm asking for real." For a moment, they just stared at each other. The rain hit harder against the windows, filling the room with its rhythm steady, cleansing. Alexander stood slowly, his steps cautious, as though approaching something sacred. He stopped a few feet away from her. "I don't want to fix what we were," he said quietly. "I want to find who we are now, even if it takes time. Even if it means starting from nothing." Emma's throat tightened. The part of her that wanted to believe him fought with the part that had learned to stop hoping. But something about the way he stood unguarded, without the armor of pride, made her heart falter. The thunder rolled softly in the distance. The storm outside was relentless. But inside, there was a strange calm, the kind that comes before surrender. She took one step toward him, then another. And when she stopped in front of him, she saw it not the powerful man everyone else saw, not the millionaire or the strategist, just the man who had once held her on a beach in Malibu, laughing into the wind. "Alexander," she began, but her voice broke halfway through. He reached up, his fingers trembling slightly, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. The touch was hesitant, reverent. "You don't have to say anything," he whispered, but she did. "I missed you," she said softly. The words almost lost to the rain, even when I didn't want to. His hand lingered near her cheek, his thumb brushing lightly against her skin. "I missed you too. Every day. I just didn't know how to reach you anymore." And that was it. The truth neither of them had dared to speak for years, small, unpolished, human. For a heartbeat, they stood still. The air between them crackled, full of unshed words and quiet forgiveness. Then, without thinking, without permission from logic or pride, he leaned in. The kiss wasn't urgent, it wasn't dramatic. It began the way rain begins softly, unexpectedly, like something that had always been meant to fall. Emma froze for a second, startled by how familiar it felt. How right. Her breath caught as his lips brushed hers, gentle at first, then deeper, not to claim, but to remember. And suddenly, the years between them didn't matter. The silence, the distance, the walls, all of it dissolved into that one fragile moment where everything that had been broken seemed to breathe again. Her hands rose to his shoulders, and she kissed him back, not out of forgiveness, but out of recognition. Because despite everything, her heart still knew the rhythm of his. The rain pounded harder against the glass, the thunder echoing somewhere far above the city. But inside, the world narrowed to warmth and breath, and the faint sound of two people remembering what it meant to be alive. When they finally pulled apart, Emma's eyes were wet, though not from tears. She rested her forehead against his, her voice trembling. "That doesn't fix everything. I know," he whispered, "but it's a start." She smiled then, small, hesitant, but real. "You always did believe in second chances." He looked at her, a hint of wonder in his eyes. "Only when it's you. Outside, lightning split the sky, lighting up the skyline for just a second brief, brilliant, gone. And in that flash, they both saw something they hadn't seen in years. Not perfection, not certainty, but the possibility of beginning again. They stood there for a long time, the sound of the storm fading into something softer. The city glowed beneath them, alive and imperfect. Emma finally pulled back, her hands still resting against his chest. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "will still be hard." Alexander nodded. "Then we'll start with tomorrow." And for the first time in what felt like forever, she believed him. They turned back to the window, watching as the storm began to ease. The glass was fogged, their reflections blurred together, not two people defined by what had been lost, but by what might still be found. He slipped his arm around her waist, tentative but sure, and she didn't pull away. The city below breathed again. The rain softened to a whisper. And somewhere deep in the quiet, between regret and forgiveness, two hearts began slowly, gently to find their rhythm again. Sunlight crept softly through the tall windows, spilling golden streaks across the hardwood floor. It touched the edges of the coffee table, the folds of the black silk dress Emma had lain carefully on the chair the night before, and the faint curve of her hair as she sat cross-legged on the couch, sipping slowly from a steaming cup. The city below glimmered quietly, waking in its usual rhythm, but inside the penthouse, time seemed paused, gentle, deliberate, intimate. Alexander hadn't left as he usually did. Instead, he was in the kitchen, fumbling with the coffee machine like a man learning patience for the first time. The sound of water dripping, the soft hiss of steam, filled the quiet space. Emma watched him for a moment, the corners of her lips lifting in a small, almost imperceptible smile. There was something human in his clumsiness this morning, something she hadn't noticed in years. He poured the coffee carefully into 2 mugs, one slightly crooked, spilling a few drops onto the counter. "Sorry," he muttered, dabbing at it with a napkin. "Still getting the hang of this." Emma laughed softly, the sound warm and easy. "It's fine," she said. "I don't need perfection." He handed her a mug, and their fingers brushed briefly. She felt a small thrill, the kind that comes from contact, remembered after too long an absence. Alexander leaned against the counter, watching her take a careful sip, as if he could memorize the moment, her posture, the way the light caught her eyes, the subtle curve of her smile. For once, the penthouse didn't feel like a stage. It felt like home. Not a grand, perfect home, with every surface gleaming and every detail curated to impress, but a real home, filled with presence, with warmth, with laughter that belonged to them. Emma set her cup down and stretched, letting the sunlight warm her shoulders. "It's nice," she said quietly, "to have a morning that's ours." Alexander nodded. "It is?" He glanced at her, then toward the window, hesitant. "I know I've been absent." She studied him, her gaze steady. "Yes, but I'm here now," he said, a small edge of hope in his voice. "And I want to be present. Really present." Emma's lips curved in a soft smile. "That's all I've wanted for a long time." They stood there for a moment, the hum of the city below, the faint scent of coffee mingling with the lingering fragrance of jasmine from her perfume. Neither spoke for a while, and yet there was a rhythm in the silence, a slow, shared breathing, a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted. Alexander reached out then, carefully, tentatively, taking her hand in his. She didn't pull away. Her fingers curled around his with the ease of familiarity and the thrill of something new. "Shall we breakfast?" he asked, a little unsure. Emma nodded. "I'd like that." They moved together to the small dining table, still tucked in the corner of the living room. Alexander poured another cup of coffee, then slid a plate of toast and fruit toward her. They ate slowly, neither rushing, savoring the simple act of sharing a meal. There were smiles between bites, soft glances that lingered, a sense of discovery in the ordinary. Outside, the sun rose higher, painting the city in brighter hues. The streets were alive with traffic, voices, the constant pulse of New York. But inside the apartment, time had slowed, measured not in hours, but in the quiet exchange of presence and touch. Emma reached across the table, brushing a crumb from Alexander's hand. He caught her fingers lightly, a playful glint in his eyes. "You still notice everything," he said softly. She smiled. "I notice what matters." He let her hand go reluctantly, but the warmth remained in the space between them. There was no need for grand gestures or dramatic declarations. The presence, the laughter, the soft rhythm of shared morning. It was enough, for now. It was everything. After breakfast, Emma leaned back in her chair, stretching her arms over her head, letting the sunlight warm her face. "It feels like we can start again," she said, more to herself than to him. Alexander's eyes softened. Slowly, he agreed, really slowly. "I don't want to rush this. I want it to last." Her gaze met his, steady, calm. "Me too." He poured another cup of coffee for himself, and they sat together in silence, listening to the city waking up, the soft clink of spoons against ceramic, the distant hum of traffic. No words were necessary. The space between them was filled with presence, with intention, with the possibility of a new beginning. For the first time in years, Emma didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel like part of the furniture. She felt alive, seen, recognized not for appearances or duty, but simply for who she was. Alexander, sitting opposite her, felt it too. The weight of absence, the years of inattentive silence, the quiet ache of regret, all tempered by the soft, undeniable warmth of now. And in that gentle, golden morning, with coffee warming their hands and the city breathing around them, two hearts began to beat in rhythm again, cautiously, deliberately, fully. The sunlight shifted across the room, highlighting the edges of the black silk dress folded neatly on the chair, a silent reminder of yesterday's awakening. Emma reached out, smoothing it lightly, then looked up at Alexander. "Shall we see what comes next?" she asked softly. He smiled, a small, unguarded smile. "Yes, together." And in that quiet, intimate space, between laughter, coffee, and the faint hum of the city, a beginning stretched before them, unhurried, real, and full of promise. The morning light poured into Alexander's office, bright and unyielding. The city below buzzed with life, indifferent to the storm brewing inside the room. Papers were stacked neatly on the dark oak desk, but the numbers scrawled across the latest financial report made them seem fragile, almost meaningless. Alexander ran a hand through his hair, loosening the tie he hadn't dared touch all night. He had a board meeting in less than an hour. The company was facing a serious financial crisis, one that could topple years of deals, acquisitions, and carefully built empires. Advisors had warned him, partners had whispered, some even suggested taking the safe route, cutting corners, sacrificing values for appearances. It would be easier, cleaner, controlled, but Alexander's mind wasn't on the company today. It was on Emma. He thought about her from the night before, the way she'd stood by the window, quiet, resilient, alive, the black silk dress, the light in her eyes that no crisis, no silence had ever dulled. For the first time in years, he realized what mattered most wasn't control, wasn't power, wasn't even reputation. It was her. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. He couldn't fail her, not in principle, not in trust. The board might see weakness, the world might judge, but the quiet truth inside him was sharper than any public fear. Losing her was far worse than losing the company. The boardroom was packed, chairs scraped lightly against marble, voices murmured, and the tension was almost tangible. Alexander stepped in, posture straight, his face composed. Advisors nodded politely, shareholders watched keenly, but he only saw the weight of their expectations as a backdrop. He began the presentation, charts, projections, figures all laid bare. Questions came fast, incisive, unforgiving. He answered with precision, but also with honesty. He didn't sugarcoat the risks. He didn't offer illusions of safety. When some suggested cutting corners, redirecting funds, or bending rules to appease the market, Alexander shook his head. "No," he said firmly, the words slicing through the polite hum of the room. "We will not compromise our values. We will navigate this challenge with integrity, not shortcuts, because our legacy isn't just profit, it's trust, it's people, and I will not risk either for the sake of appearances." A hush fell over the boardroom. Eyes widened, whispers stopped, and for a moment, he could hear nothing but the faint ticking of the clock and his own heartbeat. The choice was risky. They could push back, investors could panic, but his gaze was steady, anchored in the thought of Emma waiting at home, the first light of dawn on her face, the warmth of her hands in his. The questions slowed. Some board members nodded in agreement, impressed by his conviction. Others were silent, skeptical, uncertain, but Alexander didn't falter. He spoke from a place deeper than strategy, from a place of heart, from a place he had long ignored in favor of ambition. After the meeting, he stepped out into the hall, shoulders tense, mind still buzzing. He felt a tremor of relief mixed with fear. He had chosen what was right, not what was safe, and somehow, in that decision, he felt more present, more alive than he had in years. At home, the apartment was quiet. Emma had left for the studio she was reopening, a new project she had poured herself into, a project that reflected the courage she had rediscovered. Alexander looked around at the penthouse, the sunlight pooling across the floor, the faint scent of coffee from the morning lingering, and realized that success without her, without their connection, meant nothing. He moved to the balcony, looking out over the city. Below, the streets were alive, bright, indifferent. He imagined her walking among the people, aware of herself, claiming space in the world. And he felt a quiet determination settle in his chest. No deal, no board, no number on a ledger could compare to this. He pulled out his phone, typing a short message he almost didn't dare send. "I'm home early tonight. Can we talk?" He stared at it, hesitated, then pressed send. Minutes later, a reply came. "I'll be here." He exhaled slowly, a tension that had coiled in his chest for years, finally releasing. Just a fraction. It wasn't resolution, it wasn't certainty, but it was a step small, fragile, real. Alexander closed his eyes, letting the warm sunlight wash over him. In the quiet of the penthouse, in the hum of the city beyond, he felt a shift inside. He no longer feared losing power. He no longer measured worth by reputation. There was only one thing he could not bear to lose, and that was her. And for the first time, he understood what it meant to fight not for himself, but for the fragile, luminous presence of someone he loved. The city below continued its relentless rhythm. Inside, Alexander felt a stillness he hadn't known for years, the stillness of a man who had chosen heart over ambition, presence over control, love over fear. He turned back toward the apartment, toward the empty space where she would return, and whispered softly, "I won't fail you again." The morning light shifted, spilling brighter across the floor. The world outside could challenge him, could threaten his empire, could test every resolve he had. But inside, he carried a certainty that mattered more than anything else. For Emma, for them. And in that quiet, golden moment, he felt the possibility of a love strong enough to endure even the hardest storms. The morning light filtered through the tall studio windows, soft and warm, spilling across unfinished sketches and piles of fabric samples. Emma stood in the center of the room, barefoot on the polished wooden floor, letting the sun fall over her shoulders. The faint scent of fresh paint mingled with coffee, the quiet hum of the city outside, a gentle backdrop to the quiet anticipation inside. She ran her fingers along the edge of a drafting table, feeling the smooth surface beneath her palm, and breathed in slowly. This space finally hers carried a sense of possibility she hadn't known she could hold. For years, she had existed within someone else's orbit, her life curated by schedules, expectations, and the invisible rules of a world she barely belonged to anymore. But now, standing in the empty room, Emma felt it the freedom to create, to be seen, to exist fully in her own light. Her first project, Light Within, was more than a design showcase. It was a declaration, a promise to herself and anyone who might look. Courage matters. Presence matters. She moved to a large sheet of paper pinned to the wall, covered in sketches and notes. Each line represented a thought, a fear, a hope. She traced the curve of a doorway with her finger and imagined the way sunlight would pour through it, the way visitors would pause, their eyes drawn to the soft glow, the subtle interplay of shadow and reflection. This wasn't about grandeur. It wasn't about impressing anyone. It was about truth. Emma paused and let her hand drop. She could hear her own heartbeat in the quiet studio, steady and strong, like a small drum calling her forward. She thought about Alexander and the tumult of the last week's the gala, the storm, the nights of confession and rain. There had been moments when she had feared vulnerability, had feared opening herself fully again. But here, in the space she owned, that fear was tempered by resolve. She opened a drawer and pulled out a box of color swatches. Each tone was deliberate golds, silvers, soft blues chosen to capture light, warmth, reflection. She spread them across the table, arranging and rearranging, testing the ways they interacted, the way they could transform a room into something alive. Her fingers lingered on a particular shade, a soft amber, the color of sunlight spilling across a city street in the early morning. It reminded her of the mornings she and Alexander had shared after the storm, quiet, hesitant, full of small truths rediscovered. Emma smiled, a slow, private smile. The studio felt like a beginning, not a grand one, not a perfect one, but hers. She could build walls, light, and shapes that reflected the courage it took just to show up, to exist in the world unguarded. Light Within wasn't just an exhibition, it was a metaphor for the choices she had made to speak, to be seen, to claim her own space. She walked across the room to the window, watching the city move below. Delivery trucks rumbled past, early commuters hustled along sidewalks, and the distant hum of traffic felt like a pulse connecting the building to the heart of Manhattan. Emma exhaled, letting the noise and rhythms settle around her. She could almost feel the walls of the studio breathing with her, waiting for her to fill them with light. The door opened quietly behind her, and Alexander stepped in. He paused, leaning against the frame, watching her move through the studio with a calm precision. His presence was gentle, unassuming, but undeniably felt. Emma glanced back and met his gaze. and in that silent exchange, a shared acknowledgement passed between them of risks taken, of spaces reclaimed, of beginnings made real. "You've done a lot already," he said softly. Emma tilted her head, studying him. "It's only the start." He smiled, a slow, tentative smile. "It suits you, this. You." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Emma felt warmth in her chest, not from flattery, but from recognition she had created something that was hers and hers alone, a place where her voice, her vision, and her courage could exist without compromise. She moved to the center of the room again. Lifting a light fixture for closer inspection, Alexander stepped closer, observing quietly. The fixture caught the sunlight streaming through the windows, scattering it across the floor in a pattern that shifted and danced with the day. Emma ran her hand along it, adjusting it slightly, feeling the subtle movement of shadows and reflections. "It's beautiful," he said, softly, as though speaking too loudly might shatter the fragile perfection of the moment. Emma looked up at him, her eyes steady, confident. "Not because of me, because it's meant to catch the light." He nodded, understanding more than words could express. This was her autonomy, her reclamation, her courage made tangible. And in the quiet of the studio, Alexander felt both awe and humility, aware that her strength didn't diminish him, but challenged him to match it, to be present in the life they were building together. Emma walked over to a table covered in small models and sketches. She picked up one, a tiny representation of a hallway lined with glass panels that would reflect and magnify sunlight. She traced her finger along the miniature surface. "This is about showing people that they can step into the light without fear," she said. "That presence matters more than perfection." Alexander moved closer, resting his hand lightly on the edge of the table. "You're showing yourself first," he said quietly. She nodded. "I have to?" He watched her for a long moment, the sunlight glinting off her hair, the faint smile on her lips. In that quiet observation, he felt the depth of her transformation, the courage, the reclamation of self, the embrace of vulnerability. Emma set the model down and turned to him, eyes bright. "This is just the first step. Light Within isn't just about the exhibition. It's about presence, about daring to be real, about refusing to shrink." Alexander nodded, feeling a quiet swell of pride. Not pride in ownership or power, but pride in witness and seeing the woman he loved fully awaken, claim her space, and shine in her own right. The city below continued its relentless rhythm, but in the studio, there was a different pulse, steady, alive, and undeniably theirs. Emma exhaled slowly, looking around at the empty space she would soon fill with her vision. "It's a beginning," she said softly. "Yes," Alexander agreed, "and it's yours." For the first time in a long while, she believed it. The sunlight shifted, casting long, deliberate shadows across the wooden floor. Emma walked to the window, letting the light fall across her face. Alexander remained by the table, silent, but fully present, and in that moment, two people individually renewed. Together, rediscovering felt the quiet thrill of a world that could finally hold them both, whole and unafraid. A gentle breeze drifted through the open windows, ruffling sketches and notes. The city hummed faintly below, unaware, patient, and in the soft glow of morning, Emma's studio, her space stood ready to welcome the world. The gallery was alive with quiet anticipation. Soft lights glimmered off polished floors, reflecting in the tall mirrors that lined the walls. Emma moved among the installations with a calm energy, guiding the first visitors, answering questions with gentle authority. Yet her mind was partly elsewhere, alert, aware, waiting for a presence she hadn't yet seen. The morning had been a whirlwind of preparation, and now the exhibition, Light Within, stood unveiled, the realization of months of courage, design, and painstaking attention to detail. She paused near the central installation, a series of suspended glass panels catching sunlight through the skylights above. Each panel scattered light in complex, delicate patterns, casting small rainbows across the room. Visitors lingered, mesmerized, their faces reflecting the spectrum of colors dancing on the walls. Emma's chest tightened in a way that felt both thrilling and terrifying. And then she saw him. Alexander had arrived quietly, without announcement. He lingered near the doorway, his hands in his pockets, watching her with a focus that made the crowd around them fade into blur. She didn't see him yet, busy explaining a detail of her design to a visitor. But he saw her. Every movement, every gesture, every flicker of her expression, he absorbed it all. He stepped closer, the polished floors echoing softly under his shoes. Mirrors reflected his silhouette, multiplied and stretched across the space. But his gaze was fixed entirely on her. She paused mid-explanation and turned. Catching sight of him for the first time, Alexander smiled gentle, warm, and unlike the man who had once retreated behind work and indifference, he didn't rush toward her. He didn't speak immediately. He simply stood there, letting her presence fill the space between them, letting her see that he had come, that he had noticed, that he was fully present. The visitors nearby murmured softly, sensing a quiet electricity between the two of them. But Alexander ignored the world. He took a slow step forward, then another, closing the distance just enough that Emma could feel his intention without being overwhelmed. "Emma," he said finally, his voice low but certain, carrying through the quiet hum of the gallery. She turned fully to him, eyes wide, heart quickened. "Em, you don't just exist. You are the light." The words landed softly but firmly, not a compliment, not flattery. A truth he had come to see after months of distance, after nights of reflection, after witnessing her reclaim herself piece by piece. Emma felt her breath catch. The light in the room seemed to intensify as if responding to his declaration. She stepped toward him, her hand hovering in uncertainty, the need to reach for him, battling with the instinct to remain grounded in her own strength. Alexander extended his hand, not commanding, not requesting, but offering an invitation, a bridge. Emma placed her hand in his. The contact was electric yet comforting, like the first touch after years of absence. He held her gently, eyes never leaving hers, his other hand brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. The gallery's mirrored walls reflected them, multiplied infinitely, but for them, there was only this moment, undivided, timeless. The visitors kept their distance, sensing a personal scene unfolding amidst the art and light. A soft murmur moved through the room, but Alexander and Emma were anchored in a quiet bubble, their breathing slow, synchronized. It was not a dramatic reunion. It was recognition, a meeting of two hearts that had weathered silence, misunderstanding, and the slow erosion of attention, now reclaiming space together. Alexander let the words linger, the declaration of her essence. "You are brilliance," he said softly, "not just visible to me, but undeniable in the world. I see you truly." Emma's eyes glimmered with unshed tears. For so long, she had feared being overlooked, diminished, reduced to a reflection in someone else's life. Yet here he was, seeing her as she had always hoped to be seen, vibrant, autonomous, radiant. She exhaled, a mixture of relief and disbelief, and allowed herself a small, genuine smile. "I've been afraid," she admitted quietly, "afraid that my light would never be enough, that it would go unnoticed." Alexander shook his head, gently, as if dispelling the shadows of the past. "It was always enough. Emma, I was blind. I let the world and my own fears blind me. But not anymore." A soft beam of sunlight cut through the skylight above, scattering across her hair, the mirrored walls, the intricate panels of her installation. It caught Alexander's face as he spoke again, the intensity of his gaze softened by warmth. "You are the light," he repeated, not for the gallery, not for the visitors, but for her. Emma felt the tension of months, the weight of solitude and restraint, lift in a single moment. She stepped closer to him, closing the gap that had long been measured in years of unspoken words and restrained presence. His hand lingered on hers, firm and certain, the silent promise of support, recognition, and unwavering attention. For a heartbeat, the room fell away. Mirrors multiplied their images endlessly, sunlight and color reflecting across every surface. Yet, it felt intimate, contained, theirs alone. Emma realized, in that quiet expanse of light and reflection, that her journey, her reclamation had culminated not just in the exhibition, but in the acknowledgement that she had always been seen, truly, for who she was. Alexander took a gentle step forward, closing the final space between them. "You are more than existence, Emma. You are life itself," he whispered, reverent, almost afraid to disturb the fragile perfection of the moment. She placed her free hand lightly against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. "And you see me," she replied, voice soft but certain. The crowd shifted, but neither noticed. The art, the mirrors, the gallery lights all faded into background. The world outside waited, but in this central moment of the exhibition, Emma and Alexander existed in a space defined only by light, truth, and the undeniable gravity of recognition. She allowed herself to smile fully, the first real, unguarded smile of the evening. "Then perhaps," she said, "this is just the beginning." Alexander nodded, his eyes never leaving hers. "It is," he agreed. "The light has only just begun to shine." And in that gallery, amid reflections, color, and the soft murmur of guests, two hearts found themselves fully present, fully seen, fully alive at last meeting in the space they had both longed for, illuminated by their shared and undeniable light. The gallery shimmered under the warm glow of the golden lights, the evening crowd murmuring softly around Emma's installations. She moved gracefully among the guests, her hands adjusting a display here, offering a gentle explanation there, her presence calm yet magnetic. Every visitor seemed drawn to her energy, to the confidence she had reclaimed, to the subtle brilliance of her work. And then Alexander appeared. He didn't announce himself. He simply stepped into the center of the room, his posture straight, his expression unreadable at first. But the moment his eyes found hers, everything shifted. The golden light caught his face in a way that made him look both vulnerable and unwavering. And Emma felt the familiar pull in her chest, a mixture of anticipation and the quiet thrill of recognition. He moved forward through the crowd with purpose, the soft hum of conversation fading into the background. People noticed him, some craning their necks to watch, but Alexander was focused only on Emma. Each step seemed deliberate, measured, yet filled with urgency. She could feel the weight of his gaze before he even reached her. When he stopped, he knelt down on one knee in the center of the room. The suddenness of it drew gasps and murmurs from the crowd, yet Alexander's eyes never wavered from hers. Emma froze, the world narrowing until it consisted solely of him, the gold of the lights, and the soft reflections from the mirrors around them. "I married you once," he began, voice low but carrying through the room. "Not because I was brave, not because I truly understood what love meant. I married you because I was afraid of losing you." His hand held something small, delicate, the glint of metal catching the light. "But now I understand. This isn't about fear anymore." Emma's breath caught. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, though she stood rooted, unable to look away. "This time," he continued, "I am asking not out of fear, but out of desire. Desire to live alongside you, fully, truly, to share each day, each moment, not because I might lose you, but because I want to be with you, really be with you." He opened the small box, revealing a ring that seemed to glow even under the warm lights. The crowd fell silent, the only sound the faint rustle of silk and the soft echo of heartbeats. Emma's eyes filled with tears. She could feel the emotions she had buried for so long, love, fear, hope, longing all converging in that single moment. She wanted to speak, to protest, to laugh through the trembling ache in her chest. But words failed her. Alexander's gaze softened, patient and unwavering. He waited, offering no pressure, only the promise that this was not a plea, but a truth, the truth of his heart, laid bare in front of her, in front of everyone, yet solely for her. Tears ran freely now. Emma stepped closer, her hand reaching out almost instinctively. "Alexander," she whispered, her voice breaking, fragile and trembling. He lifted her hand gently, sliding the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if it had been waiting for this precise moment, for these exact hands. "Will you?" he asked, soft but clear, the question carrying all the weight of their years together, all the mistakes and recoveries, all the love that had survived silence and distance. Emma couldn't find words. She could only nod, her lips trembling into a small smile. The tears continued to fall, but now they were tempered by laughter, quiet, relieved, joyful. She stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him, and he held her close, the crowd erupting into warm applause, the sound a comforting hum around the intimate bubble they had created. In that embrace, they were no longer bound by the past, no longer constrained by missteps, silence, or fear. They were fully present, two hearts beating in tandem, aware of each other's weight and warmth, grounded in a shared, tangible love. The golden lights of the gallery reflected off the mirrors, scattering across the crowd, across the polished floors, across the installations that Emma had poured herself into. But in that moment, the only reflection that mattered was theirs. Two figures entwined, perfectly imperfect, illuminated not just by light, but by the truth of being seen and chosen again. Alexander pulled back slightly, cupping her face gently. "I married you once out of fear," he whispered again, voice trembling with honesty. "This time, I choose you because I cannot imagine a day without you. Will you let me live my life with you? Emma, truly, entirely." She laughed softly, the sound mingling with the applause, mingling with her tears. "Yes," she said, the single word carrying decades of emotion, promise, and reclaimed trust, and in the gallery, amidst light, color, and the quiet awe of onlookers, they kissed slow, deliberate, full of recognition and renewal, not a kiss of haste or reconciliation by obligation, but a kiss that confirmed everything they had lost, everything they had found, and everything they would now share. Hands clutched, hearts pressed together, the world blurred around them. Emma rested her head against Alexander's chest, feeling the steady pulse, the rhythm of a love that had endured and grown stronger for it. The crowd's applause swelled, a warm embrace from strangers who could only witness but not interrupt the profound intimacy unfolding before them. Golden light pooled around them, mirrored in the glass panels, glinting from the rings, highlighting their silhouettes in a halo that seemed to pause time itself. Emma pulled back slightly, her face glowing with tears and joy. "This is real," she whispered. Alexander smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "It is," he replied, "because it's us finally, fully us." And in the soft glow of the gallery, surrounded by art, light, and the quiet reverence of those who watched, two hearts began anew, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but out of choice, desire, and the undeniable certainty of love, fully recognized and returned. For the first time in years, they were not just a couple surviving circumstance. They were two souls embracing life together, wholly, unafraid, and as the applause faded into murmurs, the golden light lingered, settling over them, a quiet promise of all the mornings, evenings, and ordinary moments they would now share fully, truly, without hesitation. October sunlight spilled across the balcony, soft and warm, brushing over the edges of the small table where a half-burned loaf of bread rested beside 2 mugs of coffee. The smell of slightly charred toast mixed with the bitterness of freshly brewed coffee, creating a familiar comfort that wrapped around Emma like a gentle embrace. She leaned against the railing, shoulders relaxed, letting the breeze tease the loose strands of her hair. Alexander stood beside her, his hand resting lightly over hers, their fingers brushing in quiet rhythm. Below, the streets of New York pulsed with life. Horns honked, pedestrians moved with purpose, and somewhere distant. A siren wailed, but up here, on the balcony of their modest apartment, all that noise seemed distant, almost inconsequential. It was as if the city had softened its roar, allowing them this space of quiet, ordinary intimacy. Emma took a slow sip of coffee, the warmth spreading through her chest. She caught Alexander's glance and smiled a small, private smile, the kind that only grows after years of shared silence and rediscovered connection. He smiled back, his eyes crinkling slightly at the corners, soft and unguarded. Neither needed to speak. The presence was enough. The bread, still slightly blackened at the edges, sat untouched for a moment. Alexander tore off a small piece, offering it to Emma. She took it, and they ate together, wordless, letting the simple act of sharing fill the spaces that once held tension, uncertainty, and doubt. The ordinary rhythm of breakfast, warm light, coffee, laughter slipping softly between them, felt sacred. Emma's gaze drifted outward, to the city skyline, framed in the golden glow of the late afternoon sun. Shadows stretched across the rooftops, and the buildings, once imposing and distant, now seemed to hum a quiet harmony with the calm inside. She inhaled deeply, the air crisp and faintly scented with autumn leaves drifting from a nearby park. She felt a weight lift from her chest, not the burden of responsibility, nor the weight of ambition, but the gentle lightness of presence, of being seen and being acknowledged, fully and without reservation. Alexander shifted slightly, leaning closer to her. He didn't speak at first, letting the moment linger, letting the warmth of the sun and the gentle hum of the city settle over them. "Finally," he whispered, his voice low and intimate. "It feels different now, doesn't it?" Emma's fingers tightened around his hand. "Yes," she said softly, the single word carrying the weight of everything they had endured, the years of distance, the nights of silence, the moments of fear and doubt. It felt like a bridge between the past and this new, tender present. They sat down at the small table together, sharing the last sips of coffee and small bites of bread. Their laughter rose and fell with ease, unforced, unhurried, the kind of laughter that grows from familiarity and healing, from knowing that the other has returned not just in presence, but in heart. A quiet pause settled over them, the kind that doesn't demand words. Emma rested her forehead briefly against Alexander's shoulder, letting the warmth of his body seep into hers. She could feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her cheek, a rhythm that no longer carried fear or distance, but certainty and quiet devotion. The sunlight shifted again, golden tones deepening, brushing across their faces and hands. Emma noticed the faint lines at the corners of Alexander's eyes, the gentle strength in his posture, and the care in his touch. She realized, without a thought or declaration, that they had both changed, not in grand gestures or dramatic confessions, but in the slow, deliberate way two people could learn to see each other, to truly notice one another again. Alexander broke the pause, but only with the smallest gesture. He reached across the table and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm glad we have this," he said quietly. "Not just the big moments, but this right now." Emma nodded, her eyes tracing the skyline, the city alive and distant below. "Me too," she whispered. She let herself smile fully, the kind that starts in the chest and spreads across the face, the kind that lingers after the world has moved on. They sat together in silence for a few moments longer, watching as the sunlight softened into the gentle hues of early evening. Emma tilted her head slightly, letting her eyes close for a brief second, taking in the warmth, the quiet, the simple peace of being present. Alexander's hand remained over hers, steady, grounding, a promise without words. Finally, she opened her eyes and looked at him. "Do you remember the first morning we shared coffee here?" she asked softly. He smiled, a small, rueful smile. "I was hopelessly clumsy," he replied. Emma laughed, a sound like soft bells, warm and ringing. "And yet, here we are," she said, "still together, still learning, still choosing each other. He leaned closer, brushing his lips gently against her temple. "Still choosing?" he echoed, and in that quiet repetition there was a depth of commitment, a softness of truth, and a gentle celebration of their journey. The city continued below, unyielding, persistent, alive with noise and motion. But up here, in their small sanctuary on the balcony, time slowed. The golden light caught Emma's hair and the faint shimmer of Alexander's eyes, reflecting a quiet, unspoken understanding between them. Life would continue to challenge them, to test patience and courage, but for now, they had found something rare and irreplaceable: presence, forgiveness, and a love that had been tempered by absence and strengthened by rediscovery. Emma rested her head against his shoulder once more, breathing in the mingled scent of coffee and the cool October air. She let herself feel the warmth, the peace, the subtle pulse of life surrounding them. No grand statements were needed, no declarations beyond this shared space. Their hearts spoke quietly, intimately, without interruption. The sun dipped lower, spilling deeper gold across the balcony, the bread, the mugs, and their intertwined hands. Emma lifted her gaze just enough to watch Alexander's face, and a soft, reflective smile formed. He met her eyes and nodded once, faintly, subtly, as if to say, "This right now is enough." And in the quiet, suspended moment between day and evening, they both understood love wasn't perfect. It wasn't constant, and it wasn't always easy, but it could be present, alive, and tender. It could be simple, yet profound. A gentle breeze rustled past, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves. Emma exhaled slowly, letting it wash over her, and whispered, "I'm home." Alexander smiled, brushing a soft kiss across the top of her head. "And I'm here," he said, voice low, steady, filled with quiet reverence. They sat together in the warm glow of the fading sunlight, sipping the last drops of coffee, listening to the faint hum of the city, breathing in unison, feeling the gentle pulse of a world that could still be ordinary and miraculous at once. The balcony, the sunlight, the small imperfection of burnt bread and bitter coffee, all of it held meaning. All of it was real. And in that delicate balance, Emma and Alexander found the quiet, enduring truth they were not defined by the past, nor by fear, nor by the noise of the world below. They were defined by presence, by choice, by the simple, unwavering act of being together. And as the sky shifted to soft evening tones, painting the skyline in muted gold and pink, Emma let her hand rest over Alexander's. She looked at the city, at the light, at the space they had carved out for themselves. A single, small smile spread across her face. A soft, shared laughter escaped him. They did not need more. The day ended, the city moved on, but here, on their balcony, love was quiet, whole, and at peace, not perfect, but truly, undeniably real. The story of Emma and Alexander carries a timeless lesson about presence, understanding, and the courage to reclaim one's own life. It reminds us that love is not simply about grand gestures or perfect moments, but about truly seeing and valuing each other, even after years of silence or misunderstanding. It teaches that relationships require patience, honesty, and the willingness to confront difficult truths, that it is never too late to speak from the heart, to express needs, or to forgive. Emma's journey shows the importance of rediscovering oneself, nurturing personal passions, and allowing one's own light to shine, rather than living only in the shadow of another. Alexander's choices demonstrate that genuine care and love involve putting values and people above fear, power, or appearances. Together, their story encourages us to cherish the small, ordinary moments: a shared morning, a quiet conversation, a simple gesture of kindness. For those of us who have lived long enough to understand the complexities of life and love, it is a gentle reminder that patience, empathy, and authenticity are the foundations of meaningful connections, and that true joy often lies in embracing the imperfect, present, and shared journey of life. Thank you so much for joining us and sharing this story with your heart. If Emma and Alexander's journey touched you, please give this video a like, share it with someone who might need a little inspiration today, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more heartfelt stories. Your support helps us keep these moments alive and bring warmth to every listener.